that, and I have my very favorite purple Pilot V-ball, if anyone would like their book signed. Are there any questions?
How did you decide what you're going to read?
I don't really know what's going to happen, so I just started. I had a reading on the radio Friday with Smile Politely Radio. Incidentally, thanks to Joel, John, and everyone in Smile Politely for breaking this book and making it into an internet sensation locally. So I just started at the beginning, and I'm going to start where I left off from there and read the story that's actually meant to be engaging and accessible and funny as a special treat for those reading. Next time I give a reading, I'll start with the one that's meant to be alienating and frustrating. So, thanks again. This is called The Bad Poet. The stories actually have pictures for titles. The title of this one is a picture of a typewriter. And I'll just read some excerpts. Ready? All right. The young poet Blake Stone had had a fight with his best friend Jasper Pierce, and then they weren't friends anymore. The fight was about bad poetry. Blake had only spoken, he felt, the truth, that most of the poetry being published was bad. His friend had said there was no bad poetry. The ferocity of his friend's defense had taken him aback, and had shown him his friend's hand. It was perhaps not irrelevant that Blake was a better poet than his friend. Blake wrote very good poetry and was a very good, hard, serious writer. The friend in question, after all, was a poet, and to be fair, some of his poems were somewhat good, but the majority were in fact bad. Obviously, his friend had trouble facing that fact. But this did not need to be a personal issue, so neither pressed it, and in fact, they never spoke again. At poetry readings, they simply got in the practice of leaving the room when one another read. Blake didn't want to hear his friend's bad poetry, and his friend presumably had trouble with good poetry, though it was not clear whether this was due to jealousy or to a simple inability to grasp the complexity, the meticulous interweaving of elements, the daring play of line breaks, the metaphoric architecture and anomalous structural consistency of a truly good poem. So it went. Poetry was more important than their friendship, and at least they could agree on that. How long his friend would go on living in denial was uncertain and a pity. He might learn something if he just shut up with his bad poetry and listened to some good poetry once in a while. There was even a slight chance that admitting that good poetry was good might make him write better poetry. It was by no means certain, but it was possible. And also, and this was a point actually of considerable irritation, good poets didn't get the respect they deserved. Given that the good poets were ignored by the marketplace, it was not unreasonable to expect that they should at least be appreciated by other poets. Certainly an appreciation of good poetry should be a prerequisite for anyone who adopted the title poet. Good poetry was not only good, but a blissful relief from the problems of bad poetry. Most of the grad students studied at Exquisite Corpse, but Jasper preferred the cafe whose hand-painted sign read The Wasteland, because it was the least pretentious cafe in the city. In fact, it was a genuinely dirty and uncomfortable place, and the coffee was often bad. Jasper, the bad poet, liked to drink bad coffee. It usually hurt him, but it seemed necessary. He would drink until he was too wired to read anything but white space. Higher and higher, all the way up, because then he would get ideas and become capable of deconstructing any artifice, no matter how tangible. The arrangement of tables and chairs was no less poetry than the furniture on the page. There were 9 letters in Wasteland, and 9 utensils in the silverware rack beside the cream pitcher. And the clatter of saucers and demi-tasses was no less music than the Charles Ives that issued from the battered radio behind the counter. The air shimmered like a signifier giving up its transparence. On the bathroom wall, Jasper wrote the letter X and nodded in satisfaction. His truest work. In the cracked bathroom mirror, the bald poet looked at his reflection, and behind it, his poem was still readable. When he returned to his book, the letters seemed shriveled on the page, spindly glyphs dangling from a dead tree. It was in such a mood that Jasper had gotten into the argument about bad poetry. When Jasper had had to prove to a resume poet, Blake, that unlike Blake's, Jasper's writing practice was not geared toward the poetry machine, as Jasper called it, but part of a living, vital practice, directly engaged with the social. And to prove his point, he had taken the poem he had been working on during the argument and put it in a crumpled blank envelope he had tucked in a spiral notebook. Carried away with the validity of his point, but in fact unsure who he would mail a poem to, he marched outside and, leaning on the mailbox, triumphantly wrote his own address, affixed a stamp, and mailed the unfinished poem to himself. Standing next to the mailbox, a bedraggled man with an artificial leg asked Jasper if he would like to buy a poem. The man clutched a sheaf of homemade broadsides. Surprised and charmed, Jasper gave the man $1 in exchange for one of the poems. Determined that the poetry of a homeless man should merit the degree of scholarship normally reserved for Homer, that evening he cleared off the tiny table that blocked off one side of his kitchenette, sharpened a pencil, lit the lamp, and sat down to read the poem. That the poem employed a number of unconventional spellings was the first thing he noticed. He decided he would not make the mistake of overlooking this disruption of the hegemony of proper academic spelling by dismissing the variants as unintentional misspellings. Similarly, the slant rhyme, he reasoned, should not be taken at face value. Several minutes later, he put down the pencil. This poem is, well, it's not bad. That would be an easy dismissal of it, he mulled. Later, at work, Jasper wrote a poem about the poem. Did society make the homeless person into a poet? Or did society make the poet into a homeless person? He changed person to Guy, then he changed it back. He liked that Guy had a decidedly unlyrical quality, and through the artifice of colloquial discourse hoped to challenge the barrier between the myth of the poet and the construct of reader. But he couldn't decide. He considered showing both versions to one of the other end-of-phase students, but the thought of exposing his creative process made him uneasy. His technique, if laid bare, might be appropriated, and he was loath to give any of his colleagues the opportunity. We'll fast forward a little bit to later on when Jasper Pierce arrives at the academic conference, the poetry conference. Jasper was late for the Gertrude Stein conference because he had to work at his new dishwashing job. He arrived after Max's reading had ended. He was pissed. He had left work carrying a teetering large coffee and wore his wet and dirty apron to the conference to serve as an ugly reminder to the other poets that, as tenured poets, they were of a privileged class. They did not have to confront the man and suffer the indignity of corporate oppression as he did. Well, it was a family-owned business, not a corporation, but still. Jasper entered the conference room after the panel had begun, strode to the front row, the wet conference agenda tucked into the pocket in his apron, and sat down. Did Gertrude Stein have a job? He scrawled brazenly on the program and showed the note to the woman. Hello, "Hello, my name is Amethyst Quinn," seated next to him. She took no notice, so he tapped her on the shoulder. Her dark glasses swiveled to him. She hissed something inaudible and turned her attention back to the critic reading the paper at the podium. Having thus succeeded in politicizing the proceedings, Jasper took out the battered pad with which he wrote at work and composed a poem. Practice, he thought, is everything. He was a man of action and not to be lulled into inactivity during this precious moment of free time. The critic took a couple of questions, the microphone fed back and then cut out abruptly, leaving her unamplified. She finished answering the last question, attempting to project her voice, and then there was some applause, giving way to the murmur of poets exiting the conference room and moving out to the foyer, mingling over coffee, eyeing name tags and university affiliations, shaking hands, exchanging cards, ignoring rivals. Soon Jasper was all alone, writing his poem in the empty room. Rebelliously, he worked a double dactyl, the knowing words higgledy-piggledy, into what was essentially a free verse stanza to display his irreverent and anti-elitist approach to formal matters. Then he leapt up, realizing he was missing free pastries. So we'll read one more section. There is an incident, and it is resolved, but we won't get to that. And it's followed by many other stories that don't relate to it in any obvious way. You're going to love it. Jasper was seeing double when he made it back to his apartment building. He sensed the rejection letter the moment his fingertips touched the mailbox. Sure enough, it was addressed to him in his own handwriting. He noticed his hand was bloody and thought at once that Amethyst Quinn would never know what it meant to be steeled by continuous rejection and to struggle forward, enduring with one's vital oppositional poetics in the face of relentless exclusion from the mainstream, whose borders were carefully patrolled by obedient and unimaginative editors who curried prestige among the big names while ensuring that they and their readership would remain unchallenged by the new, the young, the revolutionary. Jasper realized he would put the whole self-addressed stamped envelope, rejection letter and all, into another envelope and send it out to a journal like that. Maybe with a cover letter stating, "Please consider the enclosed rejected poem for publication." That would throw those pinheads for a loop. To submit a poem along with its rejection letter from another publication would be to ask for its rejection, which would show that he had anticipated his own rejection before they could even think of it. And by rejecting his already rejected poem, they would be following his lead. By exposing the whole nature of the game through his refusal to play it, he would show them up for what they really were. True art, he reasoned, takes place on a higher plane than this shallow and earthly competition for the cheap satisfaction of recognition. Walking up the stairs to his apartment, he slapped his knee at the brilliance of it. He didn't even have to open the envelope to know that the poem had been rejected. By not opening it, he would show that he had never succumbed to the base hope of recognition and acceptance in the first place. Rejection was his art. It was as brilliant as Andy Warhol, John Cage, Marcel Duchamp. But wait, he realized, pausing outside his door. What if the envelope didn't contain a rejection at all? He stared at it, tried to hold it up to the light cast by the dingy bare bowl in the narrow hallway. Shook it. An acceptance letter would taint this project, fouling the purity of his rejection by co-opting him into the system, which he was sure was a risk because what better way was there for the system to defy his oppositional poetics than by trying to appropriate them, to essentially buy his silence. What if the poem had been accepted? What if they were paying him? He stared at the envelope. It had been mailed recently. Upset by the uncertainty, by the schizophrenia induced by being simultaneously inside and outside the system, He entered his apartment and threw the envelope away unopened. Schrodinger's, he thought, cat. He stared at the self-addressed stamped envelope in the garbage can lying atop the coffee grounds, the banana peel, and the plastic wrapper from the ramen noodles. The stench was revolting. He would decide in the morning whether to open the rejection, when his head was clearer, and he was better able to assess the possibility that the poem had been accepted. It was, after all, he felt, actually a good poem, though it was unlikely, of course, but not inconceivable that it would be recognized as such. Well, they couldn't all be idiots at poetry journals. Surely an intelligent person must slip through the cracks now and again and make it into a position of editorial influence. He decided to leave the letter on the table and deal with it in the morning. As he bent to pick it up, unexpectedly, he threw up. And again. Wait, there's more. The letter was soaked and unopenable. As he fell asleep, he saw stanzas behind his eyelids. He dreamed he was ink and the universe white space. And then the world ends.